Hello Aurora lovers, this is DaleBoan from DaleBoan Imaging, and this is Aurora Hunting 101. This is episode 18, How Can I Use Light Pollution Maps? Light pollution maps allow us to determine darker areas where it may be easier to see the northern lights. In North America, the northern lights are most often in the north. So it's important to try and pick a location where there is less light pollution to the north. Let's take a look. So if you Google light pollution map, you're likely to end up at this site. And this is certainly there's a number of sites that have light pollution maps. I think most of them are just displaying the same information different ways. There are different sets of light pollution maps over the years. This one is displaying the World Atlas from 2015, and it's not going to change too much in the short term. And what we're really looking for is the relative brightness. So let's start with this one. So if you're looking at North America, you can see that there's a very definite split between the east and west. In the west, there is much less light pollution in general than there is in the east, especially for the US. Canada's in here a little bit, Toronto and Montreal there. Ottawa just sort of blends in with the US light pollution. So trying to find dark sky in the east is certainly much harder than finding it in the western parts of North America. You can see that there's quite a bit of light pollution in Western Canada as well, and I'll come back to that. So in general, like I said, the northern lights form in the north and then expand down. So unless you're fairly far north, you're probably not going to see the northern lights south of you. It's possible. I live in Saskatchewan, which is in Saskatoon, which is here, and 2 nights ago the northern lights went past overhead, and they were visible in the south for me. Probably not. That probably wouldn't have happened if I was in Regina. And the further south you go, the less likely that is to happen. So what I always say is the first choice generally is to go north. But take a look and see if you're just driving towards another light source north of you. For example, if you're in Chicago, going north is just going to run you into Milwaukee. And maybe in here you might be able to, it might be better, but you're still going to have that light dome lighting up the sky from Milwaukee. So it'd be better to go from Chicago the same distance east or west, and you're going to get into a less light polluted area and one that has less light to the north. If you go and get here, then you're looking out over the lake and you're not going to have really any light pollution over the lake other than what's scattering from Chicago. So that's generally the goal. Cincinnati, don't go to Columbus, maybe go over here this direction. That's the general idea. Some areas have, there's fairly dark areas here in Pennsylvania, in West Virginia, just outside of DC. So even though New York, Philadelphia, DC, and Baltimore are fairly light polluted, you can get away from it relatively easy. Easy if you're willing to drive a bit. If you're going to drive, definitely try and drive north. Going north you know, 50 kilometers or 30 miles is not going to make any difference on how visible the aurora is. Even 100 miles or kilometers isn't going to make a difference. You start talking about 200 or 300 or 400 kilometers or 250 miles, that will start making a difference on the visibility. So you can think about that in terms of how far you're willing to travel. Now keep in mind that aurora forecasts are not the most reliable. So, you know, you have to do that trade-off. Is it worth driving, say, 4 hours north and maybe nothing happens? If there's a weaker event, you're more likely to see it if you're that much further north. But, you know, it is a trade-off. I have met people that have flown from the southern U.S. into Banff because the forecast for the weekend was good for northern lights. Some of them got to see northern lights, some didn't. But that's always a risk when you're traveling. So there's this map. It is fine. I actually sort of like this style a little bit better, except it's not at a convenient URL. So it's on GitHub. And if you open it here, you get, you know, it's essentially the same, but it's got sort of these steps in color. And this one, this one, it's sort of blended the color areas together, which is actually more realistic. But if you look on here, you get these steps. And I'll go back to Saskatoon because that's where I'm most familiar with it. Oops, this is not Saskatoon. Saskatoon here. So I can drive here and photograph the northern lights here. There is light coming from the city, but not enough to wash out the northern lights. Enough to light up the clouds, though. And then, you know, you start getting out into the yellow areas or the dark yellow areas. Visibility is pretty good, as long as you are not south of the city. Like, you can come down here and photograph the northern lights, but there will be this dome of light pollution in the bottom on the horizon, which, you know, all things being equal, why go south when you can go north? Sometimes, like I said, north is not the best choice. Saskatoon has a couple small cities, Martinsville and Warman, north of it, which extends light pollution away from the city a little bit. So we usually go east or west or northeast. But here it's relatively easy to get to a fairly dark area as opposed to eastern U.S. Most of this, we think of light pollution as primarily from the cities, but industrial light pollution is also becoming a problem. For example, this is Calgary and Edmonton in Alberta. There's a fair amount of oil refinery plants in Edmonton. Edmonton has a smaller population, I believe, than Calgary, but it's got a bigger light dome. This area up here, there's almost, won't say zero, but very small populations in that area. This is Canadian oil sands, so basically a big strip mining area. These are oil fields down along here. This is all oil fields. If you go down to North Dakota, this is all oil fields again, I believe, in North Dakota. So there's significant light pollution. My pet peeve is Moose Jaw is a little city of 35,000 people. This is a single mine. And it's very new. It's opened within the last decade, and it's got really poorly designed lighting. There's no reason for it to create that much light pollution. Yeah. So if you look at the scales, you can get to that from forget how I got to that. But this is the color scales for that light pollution atlas map that I was looking at, and the colors. So the magnitudes don't really help us too much, but the bottom one is much more interesting. So that is how much brighter than a normal dark sky is it. So if it's black, it's basically completely not naturally dark. You're starting getting into the dark gray and light gray. Even then it's about 10% brighter, or the ratio. So that if it's 2, the artificial sky brightness is twice as bright as natural. So any place up to, you start getting into the yellows here, it's relatively dark. So if you can get into the green and yellow areas, you're going to be fairly dark. Once you start getting into the yellows, you get that 2 times. And then city cores, where it's white, it's 17 to 46 times brighter than natural. You're not going to see much there. That said, if we go back and look at the maps, oops. Go back to this one. You know, I've photographed the northern lights inside the city several times. So if you can find larger dark areas, so maybe a very large park, Saskatoon has the riverbank, so there's not as much development along the riverbank. Often you can see the northern lights in those darker areas, as long as there isn't a bunch of light north of you. So this scale helps. There's a website called Astrospheric, and I'll talk about that in a couple more episodes. And it's got an embedded light pollution map. So I know this looks really confusing. This is a site oriented more to astronomers than Aurora people, but it does actually have KP numbers and things like that in it, as well as things that we as Aurora chasers, hunters, are interested in, such as clouds, weather, moonrise, moonset, sunrise, sunset, temperatures, and the KP forecast. So I'll do a episode on this, but in here there's all these different maps that it has. The last one is this same light pollution map, and it's got the same code that other map had, and you can see it as you're dragging it around, which maybe is a little bit helpful. They've converted it into the Bortle scale, which is something you might see. Bortle 1 is very, very dark, basically natural darkness, and 2 is very, very good. It's a scale invented for amateur astronomers who want to know where to go, and to give them an idea of how much light pollution there might be in a particular area. And we're looking for Bortle 1 to 4. 4 scans or spans multiple color codes on the maps. We probably want to avoid the 5s and 6s and 7s and 8 and 9s, but if the aurora is overhead, you might still be able to see it or fairly high on the horizon, you might still be able to see it in even fairly light polluted locations. So there are multiple locations to find light pollution maps. They all work pretty much off the same set of data and just displayed in different ways. There are a couple different sets of data, but they're just different years. So we're looking, the one map had 2015 data, the other one had 2020 data. It's going to get worse. Light pollution keeps getting worse, and LED lighting has not helped, because you can have more light with less electricity by using LEDs. So there's a global problem with light pollution getting worse. I didn't actually show Europe, but Europe is very similar to the eastern US. So the maps can help you find a better location to view the northern lights. What you're looking for is a spot where you're not in a really bright area, maybe on the edge of a really bright area, but with fewer light sources to the north of you, because that's where the northern lights are going to be. So with that, please check out episode 19, How Do I Photograph the Aurora? And I'm wishing you clear skies and happy hunting.